bono, who's on fellowship leave for the next 2 years. This evening, we continue our great fall lineup for conversations from the Cullman Center, a collaboration with Live from NYPL. Cullman Center fellow and historian Faith Hillis will discuss her new book, Utopias Discontents, Russian Emigres and the Quest for Freedom, in conversation with historian and podcaster Mike Duncan. You may know that the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows each year for a 9-month term. The program was founded in 1999, and to date, we've supported the work of more than 300 fellows. Our fellows receive an office in the center and a living stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work. They come to the library to gain intensive access to our unparalleled collections in order to write the books of tomorrow. Our fellows are among the best and most promising academics and independent scholars, fiction writers and poets, journalists, translators, playwrights, dramatists, and artists at work today. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply, and the application for the next cycle will be available in June on our website. We also have an upcoming conversation from the Cullman Center with Live from NYPL on December 7th. Cullman fellow Akpan will be speaking about his new book, New York, My Village, in conversation with Alif Batuman. You can register for that or any of the other fantastic events at Live from NYPL at nypl.org/live. You can see all of our events and everything else the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter at nypl.org/connect. All these programs are made possible through the generosity of patrons like you, so please consider supporting the library however you can. If you have an NYPL library card or live in New York State and want to apply for one now, you can borrow Utopias Discontents for free. Or you can buy the book from the library shop. Proceeds benefit the library. You can find links to buy the book in the chat or on the event page found at nypl.org/live. Faith Hillis has also offered some further reading, which you can find along with ways to access these titles from the library on the event page, again, nypl.org/live. Before I invite our guest to the screen, just a couple of important points. First, real-time captions are available for tonight's program. You can click on the closed caption button or use the stream text link shared in the reminder email and chat for a live transcript. Second, this event is being recorded. The library values your privacy, so in the spirit of transparency, there are a few things we want you to know. Even though the video and chat are on an nypl.org page, they're hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you might share data about yourself, which the library doesn't control. For more details, you can visit our frequently asked questions page, along with Google's privacy policy and the library's privacy policy, all available on the event page. Okay. Our guests this evening will converse for perhaps 40 minutes. After that, we'll open the floor for your questions. You can send your questions anytime using the chat or Google form or by emailing publicprograms@nypl.org. Now to our speakers. Faith Hillis's interlocutor this evening is Mike Duncan, one of the most popular history podcasters in the world. No doubt some among our audience tonight have listened to his 2 award-winning shows, The History of Rome, about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and Revolutions, with seasons treating the American, French, Haitian, Mexican, and Russian revolutions, all described the Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution. Mike speaks tonight with Faith Hillis, Associate Professor of Russian History at the University of Chicago. Faith earned her PhD from Yale and her BA from Princeton, and is also the author of Children of Rus, Right Bank, Ukraine, and the Invention of a Russian Nation, which was named a Choice Outstanding academic title. Faith impressively conducts her research in Russian, French, German, Ukrainian, Polish, and Yiddish, and has held an array of fellowships, including from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Harvard University, and Columbia University. You may have read Faith's timely op-ed in the Washington Post entitled, "Why Trying to Distinguish Between Useful and Dangerous Immigrants Always Backfires," with the subheadline, "Yesterday's Good Immigrant Can Turn into Tomorrow's Radical." Most important, Faith was a Cullman Center Fellow in 2018-19, where she worked on the book she'll discuss tonight. Utopias Discontents explores the boisterously radical utopian communities of exiles from the Russian Empire to Europe over the course of a century. I'm so happy to welcome Mike Duncan and Faith Hillis.
Hello.
Hi, Mike. Good evening. Thank you for being with me tonight.
Good evening. Thank you for letting me be with you this evening. I'm really excited to talk about the book. And as Martha said, I just want to thank the New York Public Library and the Cullman Center for hosting us. And, we've got about 40 minutes to talk, and then we've got some questions and answers from the audience after that. So I think we should just dive right into this thing. And we do, just to set the scene here, we have to do the obligatory, why did you write this book question? Was it something that comes out of previous research? Was it an individual story? You just felt there was a gap in the literature? Was it something more personal? So why did you write the book?
Well, to be honest, I'm never good at knowing what I'm writing when I start. As a historian, I'm driven by the sources. So I start with the sources first. And this can be a frustration for me sometimes because I get in some great archives, start reading things, decide what's interesting, and then decide where to go from there. But in short, for a variety of reasons, I started this project in the basement of the Hoover Archive at Stanford University, where bizarrely enough, the archive of the Tsar's secret police ended up. Long and interesting story of how that happened.
Of course that would happen. Of course, that's in California.
Exactly. So I'm sitting in a basement in Palo Alto, reading these Tsarist, very creepy Tsarist police officers surveilling Emigre communities. And I just thought, this is really fascinating. And as I read more about that world, that's sort of, I think, where I began to see the lacuna in the literature that I wanted to address. So in the end, I think the major argument of the book is that much ink has been spilled about Russian revolutionaries, right? Many, many books have been written about them, but most of what's been written about them in the past is a very high intellectual history. It's about their debates and their ideas and their treatises that they wrote. And that was important groundwork for me, but I was interested in a different question. I was interested in what it's like to live as a revolutionary and in these very particular exile communities in France and Switzerland and England and in other places that these revolutionary inhabitants called Russian colonies. So I ended up really interested in the connection between everyday experience on a very basic quotidian level and intellectual production. And in the end, I'm arguing that it's actually really hard to understand the highfalutin ideas that others have analyzed without understanding the everyday context in which these ideas are produced.
Yeah, I wish you had written this book like 3 years ago, because then I could have used it to great effect when I was trying to write my own accounts of what these people were doing when they were off in exile, trying to figure out how to take the Tsar down. Now, since we're with the Cullman Center and we're with the New York Public Library here, as you said, the Tsar's secret police files are off in California somewhere. So what is it about, what was in the New York Public Library that drew you to doing research there when you're obviously writing about these colonies that are in Europe, documents, archives, like what was it that's in the New York Public Library that makes you want to go there?
Yeah, the New York Public Library actually has one of the best collections of Russian literature from this era in the entire world. And they began collecting even before the Russian Revolution in 1899, I believe. And there are interesting ways in which my story of immigration is actually implicated in the story of the New York Public Library from the beginning, because some of my emigre figures who ultimately ended up in New York ended up giving some of their papers and documents and books that they'd brought abroad or printed abroad to the library. So the Russian collections are incredible. And I also worked a lot in the Duro Jewish division, which is also one of the most incredible repositories of Jewish literature in general, but the Yiddish press in particular. And they just have some incredibly rare materials, especially some periodicals that I worked with.
Okay, that is awesome. So, playing directly on that, and you say you're a historian, so you're starting in the archives and you're sort of building up from there. So when you're down there, of course, some of it is just boring, and some of it, isn't doing anything, and some of it's just bureaucratic paperwork. But there are also, of course, when you're down there, there are cool things that you find and funny things that you find. So I have like 3 questions about this.
Okay.
So I want to know, what was a funny thing that you found that made you laugh? I know that there's always stuff down there where you're just looking at, you're like, this is ridiculous, and it makes you laugh. So what was a funny thing that you found that made you laugh?
Great question. There were several times I burst out loud laughing doing research,
Yeah,
which is
people
always
think
embarrassing.
it's not always just business down there.
Yeah, but I think the one that really made me guffaw for maybe a good 5 minutes, and it's something that I found in that Czar's Secret Police archive at Stanford. We can talk about this later, but I show in the book how the Tsar's secret police were involved in a very aggressive public outreach campaign in Western Europe, trying to change how Western Europeans thought about Russians and trying to, portray these immigrant communities in a negative light. And some of these public outreach campaigns included short stories and prose. So I was reading these really, really bizarre short stories that Tsarist police agents had written to be placed in European journals. Very, very bad literature.
They were no good, I'm assuming?
They made no sense. They make absolutely no sense.
Okay, see, that's good, because now we're both laughing. That is fully ridiculous. Okay. Okay, so I am gonna want. Did you take like screenshots of that? I can't read it. I'll have somebody translate it for me. I want to read Zara's Secret Police short stories. So that sounds awesome.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Okay, so then what was a cool thing that when you came across it or held it in your hand, you were like, wow, I can't believe I'm holding this, or like, I can't believe I discovered this?
That moment happened in the Cullman Center, and I think some of my compatriots that year witnessed this happening. So the New York Public Library has the original print runs in very large bound copies of Iskra, which is Lenin's newspaper that he founds in Emigration. And I'm looking at, the first, second, third editions that were printed, there were only a couple hundred copies. And so I'm sitting here thinking, who held this copy? Which of the Bolshevik elite read this exact
There weren't
copy?
many of them. There were not many of them.
No, there were not many of them. It was a real inner sanctum at that point. So that was kind of a wow moment, that I'm just sitting here, sitting at a table at the Cullman Center, leafing through this 100-year-old newspaper.
That is very cool. Okay. And then the last one is also, we're going through people's lives. Some of these people's lives were quite tragic. There was a lot of hardship involved in these lives. So was there a poignant thing that you found that made you emotional, or made you, sad to be discovering something or about someone?
I think actually really the whole arc of the book I found very poignant. And I'll say that it's because it's about people who were living at a time in history where it seemed like the world was falling apart, like everything was getting worse. They were in a hopeless and helpless situation.
I don't know what that's like.
Well, exactly, right? So I wrote most of this book during the last administration at just very dark time. And I think, we'll talk about the ways in which these people failed and made mistakes, and the ways in which their dreams were not realized. But I really enjoyed thinking with and thinking through this book, just sort of about how to live in a hopeless time and how to find hope when it seems like everything around you doesn't make sense and is falling apart. So that continues to really move me, actually, just the whole story.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. That's definitely one of the principal running themes of the book. And I mean, to move on to that, the book is called Utopias Discontents, and one of the running themes is sort of the contrast, the theory and the practice of trying to set up a utopia. And as you said, you're mostly interested in the quotidian daily lives of these peoples, as opposed to like the highfalutin, theories. And so you employ, this distinction that I guess goes back to Ernst Bloch originally, which is between abstract utopias and concrete utopias. And so you return to this theme that these guys are doing are concrete utopias. So can you just sketch out like what are the difference between these two kinds of utopias, and why does it matter for our Russian emigres?
Right. So the word utopia can be a difficult one to work with, because of course the very etymology of the word is utopos, no place. Utopia doesn't exist, right? It's unrealizable. But Ernst Bloch was a German Marxist philosopher who was interested in actually reclaiming the idea of utopia as a way of, making a new kind of politics. And so Bloch distinguishes between abstract utopia, which is basically what I was just talking about, these kind of quixotic dreams of, a perfect no place that's unrealizable. And he contrasts that to what he calls concrete utopia, which for him is a praxis, a way of living your life, a way of moving towards a goal through small, simple deeds. And realizing, these grand principles that you might have, internationalism, feminism, solidarity, in your most basic day-to-day activities. I think there's kind of a similar idea in anarchist political traditions. People talk about prefiguration, but the same thing. You need to live the life that you want to realize in the future. And so this is relevant for my communities because that's what they were trying to do. Certainly they had highfalutin, abstract utopian ideas, but I'm actually arguing that those abstract utopian ideas were not only shaped, but were actually sometimes made possible, realized through everyday practices, again, of women's liberation, of Jewish liberation, of all kinds of different groups trying to organize themselves and society in new ways.
Okay. And I mean, just immediately then following up on that is they were they're radicals, they're political radicals, they're social radicals, and they are trying to do they're trying to live in ways that break free of sort of all of the social, economic, political bonds that had been trapping their bodies and their minds back in the empire. And obviously they're very progressive on women's rights. And, they're, as I've done my whole series on on various political revolutions. This is the first time you really get into the active participation of women and feminist ideals being sort of rooted in the whole movement. And I do, like in reading the book, these are their principles. And it does seem like this is how they're trying to live amongst each other. But in the end, like, how successful do you think that they were specifically in achieving gender equality, which was such a radical break with, I don't know, whatever, 100,000 years of like nonstop patriarchy? Was it hard for them to break out of these patriarchal habits? And like, if we were to interrogate the women, would they say, oh yeah, no, it was equal? Or would they say, haha, no, I was still doing all of the cooking? Like, how successful were they at this?
So I think it depends on how you define success. So on the one hand, one of the most interesting things I found researching the book that I had no idea when I started was the story of my Russian colonies actually kind of begins with students, and it begins with female students in particular. So it turns out that of the first generation of women who went to university in Europe, 95% of them were from the Russian Empire. These universities were chock full of Russian women. And so if you think of that generation of women who were able to become professionals, who in some cases actually leave radical politics and move to hold jobs like professors and doctors and lawyers, one could argue that that's a huge success. There are also other women who decide to live their lives in radically new ways. So these are places where free love is often practiced, where women are trying to get involved in politics, where many women are the economic breadwinners in the families, and the husbands are the kind of feckless, intellectuals writing and not making money.
There's a lot of loafers in the bunch.
Yeah. It's women actually doing the labor, being the doctors or doing the work that supports these radical families and also the radical politics that are thought up by the more famous men, let's say. But ultimately, I think in the book, I find that patriarchy is actually one of the hardest power structures to undo in my story. And as much as these women tried, it's very pervasive. I mean, you see that first of all in the sources themselves. So one of my frustrations as I was researching is I have a few really, really vivid sources from these female students or revolutionaries or what have you, but they're vastly outnumbered by sources from men. And the vast majority of women who lived in these spaces, moved through them, et cetera, I know nothing whatsoever about them. And I think that speaks on some level to this, just the absence of their voices, even in these communities that were claiming to try to liberate them. The other thing I'll say, though, is as the story goes, I think we see more and more of a patriarchal blowback. And I actually look at Bolshevism, which ironically later becomes famous for liberating Russian women, but that's much later after the revolution. And in Emigration, what we see is Bolshevism is explicitly patriarchal, and it rails against these kinds of grassroots feminist movements that had been present in Emigration before. Lenin wants that all very strongly controlled by the central party. So that is another really poignant part of the story. I think this generation who really believed they could change things. And in some respects, as I said, they did, but in other respects, the structures were harder to dismantle than I think they thought.
Yeah. And so just in general, I mean, the book is not called like Utopias, like happy heroes who lived happily ever after. The book is called Utopias Discontents.
Yeah.
So this isn't a story of how these ideal, I mean, these seeds obviously get planted, in these colonies, and then we are moving towards the Russian Revolution. But there's obviously it's a herky jerky kind of way of getting there, and then we're not even sure, if the revolution is accomplishing what they thought it was going to accomplish. So these colonies, you're writing about them over the course of a century, but it's not necessarily just one. It seems to be generations going through, where sort of there will be rises and peaks and fall. Like, you open with the Zurich community that kind of has a rise and a fall to it. So like, what were the internal and external pressures that sort of disrupted their ability to just truly live in a utopian way and have it just go forth and become the revolution that they hoped it would?
Right. Well, interestingly, I think there are three factors that were really distinctive about these communities that define their utopian promise, but they also all seem to have a dark side and simultaneously undermine the promise that they help to articulate. So one of the themes that I talk about is just the intensity of these spaces. These are very, very small communities. Sometimes they're a few blocks where people know each other very well. They're all either roommates or sleeping with each other or in the same party. Things get very intense. And this leads to, a lot of intellectual production, a lot of thinking together, a lot of debates that are very important, but it also leads to factionalism, doctrinalism, and a narcissism of small differences is actually something that you see quite a lot. And it's almost like sometimes the more people have in common, the more they have to dispute about, right? Another thing that was really special about these communities was their internal complexity and diversity. So although I call them Russian colonies, this is what their residents called them. These people were not mostly from Russia proper. They were actually mostly imperial minorities, Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, etc. And they're all fraternizing in these very small areas, which creates new political possibilities, right? As people are talking to each other, thinking about how they can work together, thinking up federalist schemes, things like this. But it can also lead to disputes, right? And conflicts along these lines. And then finally, there's just the unbridled idealism of these communities. And this is something we've already touched on, but once you've declared that you're going to revolutionize the gender and sexual order, you need to do it. And that doesn't always happen in practice, right? So in some ways, the ideal, the certainty that the ideals would be realized, and then the fact that the change is not realized leads to embitterment and people falling out of these communities.
Yeah. Okay. And from that, there's like three different directions we could go right now.
Yeah.
But the one I want to pick is to just go back to this idea of them being very small communities. And you talk about them as being these like pressure cookers of familiarity, where these abstract political and philosophic ideological differences like merge seamlessly with personal beefs with each other. Like, people just don't get along, and then that suddenly becomes like a rift. It's very hard to disentangle Bolsheviks and Mensheviks from like Martov ultimately doesn't like Lenin, and Lenin's like, why don't you like me? And Martov's like, because you're a jerk. And that has that plays a huge role. So like, how much do you think that these later factional conflicts that define how the Russian Revolution goes, like how much of it was just hurt feelings and personal hostilities just because they were living so close to each other? Or was it truly more ideological and philosophical? Like you're working with them on a daily level. Like, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think both are true, and actually they're entangled. So I would never want to say that there's not an ideological basis, right? These people are intensely ideological. They read and breathe and think ideology all the time. But it's really, really deep and personal. And it's not just that they're living in these close communities, but also that they've journeyed through, these experiences, traumatic experiences of prison and exile and arrest together, sometimes for decades. So at the end of the book, I talk about the factional conflicts after 1917 as very much conditioned by this experience in the colonies. And I think the example of Martov and Lenin that you gave is the perfect one. I found this memoir that really blew my socks off when I was doing this research. It's from 1918, when Martov and his Mensheviks are finally ejected from the Soviets by the Bolsheviks. And by that point, Martov is heavily tubercular and he's so stressed out, he's so angry, he's coughing, and he can't get his arm in his sleeve because his arm is shaking so much. And the Bolsheviks are very mean-spiritedly mocking him and making fun of him. And there's a Bolshevik memoirist who writes about this, who says, we just thought back in 1903, when Lenin and Martov had that fight at the party conference that resulted in Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, we just thought they were having a fight, a spat between friends. But little did we know that this became the beginning of the rift between world revolution and world counter-revolution. And that observation by that contemporary observer just really struck me that was how she understood it, that there's a deep personal beef here in addition to, legitimate ideological grievances. And it's really hard to disambiguate them.
Yeah, I have come across so many times throughout history that, we learn about these big abstract, conflicts that are going on, and it really, you can take it back down to a couple of people in a room just not getting along with each other or liking each other quite a bit. There's a lot of people who fall apart because of loyalty. Because you talked about there's, how do I want to say this? As people are leaving the empire and coming into these communities, they're leaving a place where their identity is kind of set in stone by the culture and the system that they're raised in, whether they're women, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Latvians, Ukrainians, like whatever. And then the process of sort of disengaging from that and finding a new place in a new world with a bunch of other people who are also doing the same thing leads to a lot of new kinds of identity formation and people getting more in contact with their own identities. And like right now, to connect this a little bit to modern politics, is obviously identity politics is a thing right now that is very current. Like how much, what does it mean to be a man and a woman? What does it mean to be black or white? What does it mean to be a worker or a boss? And all of these things can intersect with each other. And we see a lot of this kind of identity formation and thinking and reflecting about these things going on in the colonies. So the first one that I really want to talk about, and you said, you mentioned that the New York Public Library has amazing Jewish resources, and that, when we're talking about these colonists, so many of them are Jewish. A large majority of them are. So how much did the process of these Jews leaving the Russian Empire, coming to these new colonies, affect how they form their own Jewish identity? Because some of them, like Martov and Trotsky, obviously kind of leave their Jewishness to one side and become secular, whereas others really lean into it and become proto-Zionists. So how does their experience as emigres play into all of this?
Right. So on the one hand, I think one thing that many, and we should clarify that what it means to be Jewish in this time really varies, right, between people. They have very different sort of understandings of what that means and how they relate to it. But one trend that you do see is that the life abroad, on the one hand, makes people more Russian, in the sense that when these Russian Jews of all stripes who come over and interact with Western Jews, they're really struck by the differences and by the ways in which there's not a connection. And in many cases, the relationships between Western Jews and Eastern European Jews are really quite hostile. So on the one hand, I think you see everyone sort of having this particular, let's say, Russian Jewish identity. But on the other hand, there's a lot of fracturing that happens and a lot of new identity formation that happens. And I think one of the biggest arguments that the book makes is that the Jewish Labor Bund, which is a nationalist party, but it's also a socialist party. It's not Zionist. It's actually explicitly anti-Zionist. I argue that, this party is usually thought, it emerges in Lithuania in Russia, and it's usually understood as a product of the unique labor environment that existed in the northwestern part of the Russian Empire. But I'm actually arguing that the Bund first emerges in all places of London, of this very particular experience of Jewish labor that happens as Jewish proletarians move abroad, and the kinds of labor organizations that they create. It's London, where the Yiddish radical for Russian Jews, the Yiddish radical press really takes off. And all of these tactics and materials and organizers who've worked in London and emerged out of London end up being carried back to the Russian Empire. And I'm actually able to show this really direct transfer. So I think it changes also the way that we think about the dynamics of the Russian revolutionary movement in Russia, that there's all this, it's a feedback loop, right? It's not just about what's happening locally, but it's also about what's happening externally.
Yeah, and then I mean, connecting, like when it comes to living in these communities and figuring out how, you know, as a Jewish emigre, you fit into all of this, you know, and on the quotidian level, you're talking about, you know, you write in the book, there are various canteens and people are deciding what group they want to go to, what library they want to go to, and you know, the future first lady of Israel. You know, I mean, I don't think your hypothesis is not there was cheap food at the Zionist campaign, you know, the Zionist canteen, but that does play a role in how people interact with each other and how where they become receptive to ideas.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you also mentioned that when we talk about the quote unquote Russian colonies, we are not necessarily talking about a bunch of Russians living in a colony. We are talking about a lot of the times the minority nationalities who want to get out there. They've been living under the domination of the Russians. So as they come together, they're now mixing not just with other people from their own nationality, but also other nationalities. So do you think that life in these colonies had a tendency to drive people from the minority nationalities to reinforce their national identities and then sort of dream of national liberation for their people, and that's what they were trying to get out of it? Or did it have a tendency to break down their nationalist identities and sort of lead them toward a more internationalist approach to everything?
Strangely, I'm not sure that those are mutually exclusive. So one of the things that I show is how you do see nationalities hardening, national identities hardening, because it's so difficult to be a nationalist of any stripe, right, in the Russian Empire. People abroad are developing these national identities, but the fact that they're doing so in close proximity, once again, these different nationalities that are competing can actually reinforce each other. So one example that I'll give you is that in Geneva around 1880, there are tons of Poles there doing their Polish thing. And then Ukrainians come there and learn from the Poles and sort of emulate what the Poles are doing. And then when these Jewish migrants come, the Ukrainians actually loan the Jews their printing press to print the first revolutionary pamphlet in Yiddish. So there's all of this cross-fertilization. And I think that this idea of national consolidation, but in a kind of internationalist vein, also makes sense because a lot of the ideas that these folks are interested in are federalist. So their idea is basically, we all need to develop our national cultures, but we can do so in a federalist internationalist, you know, association that will supplant the Russian Empire. But there is also a lot of blowback. And in fact, that Ukrainian Jewish relationship that I just talked about in Geneva ultimately becomes quite ugly, and there's a big falling out. But I think you see those countervailing tensions are both there.
Right. And okay. So I mean, it's always these things. It's always a bit of both, isn't it? For personal independence, I think, in these communities than they would have had back home. But now they're faced with the kind of the same questions that everybody's faced with. Am I a woman first? Am I a proletarian first? Am I bourgeois first? Am I Jewish first? Sort of what part of my identity takes precedence? How should I start to think of myself? How should we, whoever we are, be thinking of ourselves? So how did living in these communities affect the way that the women living in these communities were able to define themselves? And were there any common results in the experience that you found? Or did each woman just sort of navigate individually to their own sort of unique conclusion at the end of the line?
I mean, of course, there are many individual stories. And I think different women are pulled in different ways. But I think the commonality that I see, especially pronounced among women, is one of disillusionment, unfortunately. Okay. I think it's not always the case, right? Some say, I did it, my life was great. But there's a lot of regret, a lot of hardship, a lot of suicide, a lot of mental illness. Women are just acutely aware, for reasons we already discussed, of the failures of these revolutionary experiments, or let's say of the difficulty of making the ideals stick.
Okay. So The last question that I have that I sort of came here with, I know is directly related to like an article that you just wrote, which is about the relationship between the host countries and the refugees as they are coming in, these Russian refugees as they come in. And you talk about how initially they were welcomed as these good refugees, which allowed the host societies in the West to like safely demonstrate their own humanity and benevolence and freedom and like, well, look what good people we are, you know, partly to distract everybody from the fact that they're off conquering India and Africa at the same time. But you talk about the symbiotic relationship, which I think this is fascinating to me, between Western liberalism and these Eastern radicals, that each allowed the other to survive, because the Russian radicals would not have been able to say and do what they wanted without the Western liberals. And then the Western liberals were able to prove, look how benevolent we are. But then later, as the years and decades go on, because obviously you're reading the Iskra papers, you know, they were not excited about these people being out there. There's a hard turn against them as the governments of Europe kind of decide that they're a menace. So what was the relationship between the colonies and the host countries? How did it change over time? And how did the Russians themselves contribute to that attitude shift?
Right. So I think of this arc as at the beginning, there's sort of a romance. I mean, I say that 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, I call it the Russian moment in European culture. Russians are everywhere. Europeans are fascinated with Russians. And they're fascinated with Russians for a couple reasons. So the first is one you've already mentioned. There are relatively generous asylum policies at this point that are very embedded in the liberal system. And I think they're often driven by genuine beneficence, but there is also always this darker side of the asylum policies. Either countries are competing to show, you know, I'm so much more generous than the other country, I take so many more refugees. There's a kind of like civilizational discourse too, that these poor benighted Russians are so oppressed, and we're gonna let them in and help them and turn them into, as one source said, a proper Britishmen. You know, we're going to send them to school and give them showers and clean them up and make them bourgeois. And then there's finally this element of beneficence to Russian immigrants, precisely, I think, to offset some of the critiques that are emerging of European colonialism and imperialism and its brutality, right? So the Russians are sort of propaganda tools, let's say, for liberal regimes. So again, this was one of the more surprising findings of the book, the ways in which Russian radicalism was, I would say, actually really made possible by these European liberal policies of asylum, and then also the entire sort of press apparatus that came with this, because a lot of the sources that I'm reading are periodical sources where people are sort of exploring these colonies and writing about them and interested in them. The final reason why Europeans were interested in Russians in this early period was they did recognize the experimental nature of these communities. And you do get contingents, for example, of European women who are sort of interested in breaking out of the social roles that are assigned to them. You get contingents of early anti-colonial activists who are active in Europe, who are looking at these Russians and are really impressed by them and are trying to emulate them, going to their meetings, talking to them in the hopes of building their own new societies. So that's the romance, that's the European moment, as it were. But the story turns very dark around 1890. And actually this turn, I think, is really crucial to understanding the dark turn in immigrant culture in general, this sense of disillusionment that I've already talked about, and the sort of physical collapse of these communities, along with the rise of Bolshevism, right? Which I think is by far the most radical ideology we've seen, and one that really explicitly rejects the softness of even European socialist parties, right? So why does this happen? First of all, it's just a result in some respects, it's a result of just cultural conflict, growing numbers of Russians. And this is the time at which you get just massive amounts of proletarian Jews coming from Russia, creating this new working class in in European cities. And again, although they're welcomed in some respect, and Europeans sort of think of themselves as the rescuers of the Russian Jews in the 1880s and 90s, there's a lot of anxiety about a variety of things, about the way they practice their religion, about their refusal to speak French or English instead of Yiddish, and this kind of thing. So you have rising nativist movements, fears of immigrants taking native people's jobs, things like that. But you also have a very, very deliberate campaign by the Russian government and by the Tsar's secret police that begins to manipulate these pre-existing anxieties. And the Tsar's police, they're not only engaged in this kind of public agitation, and they have a press bureau, they're writing these horrible short stories that we talked about before. They're doing all kinds of stuff, but they're also doing literal provocations. So we have Tsar's police agents are blowing off bombs, creating bomb plots, arming emigres. In many cases, Russian Jews, there's an explicitly anti-Semitic element to the Tsar's police activity as well, and a desire to play up on that anxiety. And they're quite effective in creating a panic about these Russians. So by about 1890, you see a really harsh turn. The generous asylum policies are gradually dismantled. I mean, the most famous example is England, right, which turns away no one since 1826, and then in 1905 passes the Aliens Act, which is explicitly designed to exclude Eastern European Jews. And I'm able to show in the book how directly this is a response to this kind of machination by the Russian government. This is the arc of the story, and again, really contributes to bad feelings and dissolution in these immigrant communities.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes out of that, and then this will be my last little sort of closing question, and then we're going to move to some viewer questions. But as you said, Lenin and the Bolsheviks come out of this as the most hard, most extreme of all of these parties. And Lenin himself was the one who seemed to be, of everybody that I've read about, seems to be the most purposefully standoffish towards emigre life in general. And so you have for 70, 60, 70, 80 years, these people who are trying to live a utopia and then have that be the revolution. And then Lenin and the Bolsheviks are ultimately the ones who win. So was there something to what Lenin was, his standoffishness, or did he need that space too?
I think so. So the thing about Lenin is he's an evil genius, right? Like his political instincts are always right on. And so I think this dark turn in immigrant culture, he senses this moment, right? That these communities are falling apart. The promise of them is about to just disintegrate. And he takes that and says, we need to do something fundamentally different. So I think he's really always able to read the pulse of the time and the moment. And this is true in Europe in 1902, 1903. And he says, we've got to completely do everything different. We're not going to do any more grassroots stuff. We're going to be highly centralized. We're not going to focus on mass meetings. We're going to be highly conspiratorial and only speak to the people we need to speak to. But he's reacting to the real situation on the ground, right? Which is that by this point, these communities have been massively infiltrated, not only by the Tsar's secret police, but also by Western police who are increasingly in cahoots with the Russians. So he's responding to these real conditions and taking it in a new way. At the same time, though, I think he's drawing on the emigre tradition of what I call living the revolution, right? It's a new form of concrete utopia. And I show in the book how his ideas about, for example, conspiracy and patriarchy and central hierarchy are things that he lives. He not only thinks them, but they're reflected in his house. They're reflected in his immediate entourage. They're reflected in Bolshevik culture. But I think Lenin's, he's always just remarkably attuned to the way the wind is blowing. And again, just as we see this in Europe in 1903, we see this in spades in Russia in 1917. Same kind of improvisational politics.
I agree with that completely. Yeah. And he's happy to change his mind when the pulse changes. Okay, so we're gonna hop over now to some viewer questions. So are you ready to play? Are you ready to play this? Are you ready to play this game? So can you talk about children in these communities? did you come across any writings or records by or about children and their experiences, whether in their teen years or younger or very young?
Mhm. Yeah, I wish I knew more about children than I do, but a few things jump to mind. First of all, there's a Bolshevik, well, sorry, he became an anarchist actually, but a famous anarchist activist named Victor Serge. That's not
Oh, yeah,
his
sure.
born name, but that's his pen name.
Yeah.
And he's part of the second generation of Russian colony people, meaning his parents were revolutionaries of the 1880s who moved abroad. In his case, I think he was born in Brussels, and he's raised in this emigre community in Brussels. And he describes it in his memoir in really vivid detail. And it's really fascinating. You know, what is it like to be the child of Russian revolutionaries? And he talks about how they have the pictures of the Russian revolutionary martyrs hanging on their walls, and just gives really, really fascinating details about what this is like. But there are too few sort of firsthand memoirs like that, and it was a little bit hard for me to trace. There are other cases in which there are children of radical emigres who actually decide to follow the opposite path. I mean, many of them in England or France go on to become, you know, go to school, go to university, become very bourgeois and leave that whole world behind. But we do, because my book goes far enough, we get, you know, second and third generations. I came across another story that was really interesting too. By the late 20th century, many of these activists, as things were heating up in Russia in the lead up to the 1905 revolution, of course, many people were trying to go back to Russia. And there are cases of some of the Bolsheviks who went back to Russia in 1905, left their children in the care of Lenin's wife. And they called her like Aunt Nadia. So there's this tradition of sort of surrogate parents as well for people who were, you know, going back to fight or who had been arrested or things like this. So you come across cases such as that. And in this case, this child also wrote a really interesting memoir, and she becomes a Bolshevik herself and goes through the revolution of 1917 and talks about that. But unfortunately, I wish I knew even more about this than I do.
Okay. So the next question is, obviously, I think you read like 40 or 42 different languages.
No.
And you, oh, okay. But like, I mean, but if you're going to Paris or you're in, Switzerland or something, you're reading about these colonies, not everybody's speaking the same language. So can you discuss the role of different languages and translations in research and writing the book?
Yeah, this is a really fun and great question that has just many different elements. So one of the things I talk about in the book is the ways in which this huge migration of Jewish proletarians that begins in the 1880s becomes radicalized abroad. So many of these people moving abroad in the 1880s were basically economic migrants. They were not revolutionaries. They were leaving Russia, simply because they had no way to live. But they end up going to cities like London and Paris, where there's already these really there's a democratic element to it too, because we have workers who are employed and who can nevertheless speak Russian and Yiddish and are sort of tasked with translating these party documents, or in some cases popular literature, stuff like this. You also have the theme of multilingualism comes up in these meetings because, like I said, these people are from all over. They have many different mother tongues. Russian tends to serve as the lingua franca, but it's not always because, for example, many of these Yiddish speaking workers only speak Yiddish. And so we have fascinating descriptions of these revolutionaries as revolutionary meetings as let's say simultaneous translation as well. And someone gives a speech in Polish, and then they bring his friend up who can translate simultaneously into Russian, and then they bring his other friend up who can translate simultaneously into Yiddish. And this gets back, I think, in an interesting and concrete way to your question about different nationalities cohabiting, and are they internationalist or are they nationalist? And here again, I think you see that they can be both or all of it. And many of these revolutionary organizations were actually explicitly multilingual and were very interested and devoted to publishing in multiple languages, precisely so they could reach all of these groups. The final thing, and this gets back to something funny, as you get these European police that are increasingly anxious about these Russians and are surveilling them along with the Russian police, there are hilarious police reports because, of course, these European agents don't speak any of these languages. So you get a situation where they go to these revolutionary meetings where, again, they're all speaking, 7 to 8 languages in simultaneous translation. The police officer understands nothing. And so his report is, Trotsky stood, his face turned very red, he waved his fist and he looked angry. But this is the level of understanding. So that's also an interesting theme that emerged.
That's a fantastic scene. I can picture, it's like watching Trotsky with the sound off,
Yeah.
Okay. So, the next question, I think we can connect these a little bit. The question is, do you think that the emigre colonies were tolerated in order to weaponize them, in a sense, a bit like how the Germans smuggled Lenin back into Russia, knowing that he would be able to destabilize the state? So was part of their willingness to keep it, were they always just anxious and sending out police to figure out what these people were doing, or were they like, no, we kind of know what they're doing and we're not so upset about it because they'll just go back to the Russian Empire and destabilize it?
I actually don't see too much weaponization in my story. I mean, certainly it emerges in World War I. And the German-Austrian story in World War I is substantial. And that's a real thing. Absolutely. The Central Powers weaponized Lenin and Bolshevism and the Zimmerwald group. But no, I don't see that earlier. And the reason is that by the eve of the war, actually all of the European powers were quite united in being really quite terrified and anxious about these communities. And far from being tolerated, they're basically being chased around the continent with no safe place left for them. A really interesting thing that I found about this was that this anxiety about these emigre communities, it of course, this is also the moment where there are international networks of anarchists, right, that start bombing European countries in the 1890s, and you begin to have international policing arrangements and accords. But the foundation of Interpol, it goes back to this moment and is in part informed by this anxiety about these radical emigres and the sort of connections between Russians and this international anarchist movement. So I definitely don't see weaponization, and I don't even actually see much toleration by the end of my story.
Wow. Yeah, I would agree with that, just from sort of my own take on what the international even outlook was at that moment. The French and British were not super interested in destabilizing the Tsar. They wanted the Tsar and his armies to help them fight the Germans. Okay, so the issue of women being disillusioned raises for me, not for me, but for the questioner, the question of gaslighting and maybe a wider failure to recognize realities, especially given that you found more materials from men than women. To what extent do you see men failing to notice the struggles of women?
That is definitely a theme. And this is one of the reasons why the women get so angry and upset. You get these men at revolutionary meetings, giving these long speeches about women's rights and things like this, but there's not a woman on the stage, right? And women question this, and many times the male revolutionaries are questioned. They don't take it kindly, and so you do see this. You see this constantly. There are also these moments in the writings of some of these revolutionaries, just these really, really misogynistic, sort of things said in passing. But there are times where women too are very frustrated by that. And so I think that this is a really persistent problem and speaks to the failures of integration and incorporation. And again, it's something that a lot of women are not quiet about, but it doesn't mean that they're able to change it.
Yeah. What was the experience of Russian revolutionary emigres in Europe who were not necessarily considered white, who didn't code as white in the societies that they were moving into, whether they were Central Asians, East Asians, Caucasians? Did you get into anything, see anything on that front?
So I didn't really come across any Central Asians or East Asians involved in these communities. There are certainly Caucasians, so people from the Caucasus, I should say. It's confusing, right? Because
not us.
Caucasian now has a different sense with racial rhetoric. So you do see people from the Caucasus. I've not actually, though, seen. Interestingly, I've not seen people from the Caucasus described as non-white. The people you see described as non-white are Russian Jews. And you have to remember that many of these communities, the workers, when they first come over, are wearing, traditional Hasidic garb, and look very different and have very different customs. And so there's a lot of anxiety about that. But I have not, it's not usually framed as a question of whiteness. It's usually framed as a question of civilization. But again, I think if there's any group that is supremely racialized, it's that group, the Russian Jews.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to this. Okay. Can you speak more about the difference between the emigre communities in the different Western European cities? So what did you like? There's London and there's Paris and there's, Zurich and even in Switzerland, different cities had different vibes.
Yeah.
So what were the different vibes? What's the Parisian colony, right? Versus, versus like somewhere in Switzerland.
Yeah, they do get different reputations. So, for example, the city of Bern. So most of the immigrants who live in Bern are university students. But again, a big part of the book is about how these students become integrated in these revolutionary networks. And Bern is famous for being a Bundes city. So it's really, so these are not workers we're talking about, but they're intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals who support the Bund. And there's also a fair amount of Zionists, but Bern is known as being a very sort of Jewish student population, and a lot of agitation and disputation between Zionists and Bundists. London is famous for its very strong anarchist community. Again, it's international in nature. They're connected to European anarchists, but it's also international in nature in that there's a vibrant Yiddish anarchist network, but it's also a major center of Russian anarchist thought. This is where Prince Kropotkin lives for a very long time. So that becomes its reputation. Paris has more of a sort of Marxist reputation, socialist reputation early on. But I should also say that it's not, these cities are, they have vibes or reputations, but as time changes, as time passes, these people are constantly circulating too. And one of the reasons they're circulating, because of party changes and splits and factions and, people get in fights and then they leave, but they're also changing because of these changing legal realities that we talked about. So the best example that I'll give you of this is that Paris is the major center of my story for most of my story. But around 1890, Paris becomes very hostile to Russian immigrants. There's a really big provocation that's done by the Tsarist secret police in 1890. This is also the moment where there's an alliance between Russia and France made in the 1890s, and this changes laws about things like extradition, and it makes the French police far less tolerant of Russians. So at this point, many of the major revolutionary figures, some of them flee to Switzerland, but most of them move to London. So it's all, and then when London becomes a worse place because of the Aliens Act and because of greater police persecution, many of the immigrants actually moved to Germany, which they had traditionally avoided because Germany always extradited to Russia. So you see, there's also kind of a game of whack-a-mole happening here. And these communities, while very networked, are also very mobile and are migrating over time.
Okay. Can you say more about the experience of the exiles when they returned to Russia? How did their experience abroad influence their attitudes towards Russian culture, Russian workers, Russian peasants, Russian life? Lenin wasn't really there in Russia for, a good chunk of his life, for example.
Right. So that's a really huge question because
you have 30 seconds. I just realized.
Just as these groups are circulating around Europe, they're also constantly trying to sneak back to Russia, right? So there are different inflection points where these immigrant communities have a really important influence in Russia. The first is in the 1870s, there's this colony of women who've been studying in Zurich, who've been practicing free love. This is kind of a real feminist community that we get. And many of these women go back to Russia and become part of the populist movement that emerges in Russia in the 1870s. And they're really instrumental in shaping its kind of democratic face. And again, the ideas about radical gender experiments that emerge in Russia around this time. The other part of the story that I would focus on, having to truncate for the interest of time, is I show in 1917, part of what I'm arguing is that 1917 is, of course, a mass revolution, right? There's a lot going on. The revolution begins as a mass revolution. It has nothing to do with Lenin or these emigres. They're very far away. They're cut off communication-wise because of the war. But when all these emigres come back after the Tsarist regime falls, they basically continue the same behavior, the same disputes, the same, all the same arguments they've been having for 20 years in immigration,
Yep.
right? With all the dreams on the one hand and all the dysfunctions on the other. So I think that the Emigre context is absolutely crucial, as I suggested before, in understanding the high political narrative of 1917, not the masses, that's different, but in understanding the way the Bund is treated, the Mensheviks in the Bolshevik regime and things like this, and just the massive violence that the Bolsheviks unleash on their left-wing adversaries. I think, again, this goes back in part to these resentments formed abroad.
Well, I think that's kind of the perfect place then to wrap it up. We got it. We got them back. They're doing 1917. So, and we're at an hour. And I think that I should just go ahead and thank you very much for writing the book, for being here, for sharing all of that with us. That was fantastic. I just learned even more. I read the whole book and I just learned things even in just talking to you right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming as well.